Hi, welcome to Education Legislation Training with an emphasis in early childhood. We will be discussing how proposed legislation changes the landscape of education. You should have been provided a slide deck in the form of a PDF where you can follow along with the slides as we discuss. We're currently on the opening slide and are moving to slide 2 now. This is going to be a 3-part series. The first part is going to be an overview of the legislative process. Part 2 is going to be about advocacy, where we will talk about the identification and tracking of legislation and how to connect with lawmakers to provide feedback in the most appropriate manner. And then finally, part 3 is going to be about helping students learn and internalize the legislative process. Okay, with that, let's get started on part 1. We're on slide 3 now, and we're going to talk about repealing, amending, or adding new laws. So some of you may remember the I'm Just a Bill on Capitol Hill Schoolhouse Rocks videos from when you were kids. Some of you may not have been around as a child when that was around, but may have seen it anyway because that I'm Just a Bill on Capitol Hill video has really kind of stuck around and stood the test of time. So each bill, and of course in this training we're going to be talking specifically about state level legislation, but each bill contains what we call repealers, amended language, and or new law. To repeal law, a bill lists out the statutory citation, that's just a way of saying the parts of statute that are going to be removed if the bill makes it all the way through the legislative process. To amend or to change language, a bill will have text that is either underlined or has strike through. Underlined language means it's proposed new language that will be added to existing law. And then language that has strike through means that it's language that's being proposed for removal. So the difference between strike through amended language and a repealer is a repealer removes the entire section. That part of law is no more. But the strike through in an amended bill, a bill with amended proposed language, it just takes out part of a section. And so the part that is either underlined will be added to that, or parts of that language that do not have underline or strike through, it'll just stay as is. So to create an entirely new law, a bill will indicate where the new law will be codified, and you'll see in all capital letters the words new law. That'll be at the very top of the bill, and that means this is brand new law. It's not adding to a current existing section of law. So one thing to be on the lookout for is bills can contain 1, 2, or all 3 of these types of changes. And so typically repealers are at the end. Sometimes they're sprinkled throughout if it's a very lengthy bill. But each section will tell you whether it's new, amended, or repealer. So those are the types of changes that we can see to statute. Now we're on slide 4, and we're going to talk about the legislative process. So legislators identify changes they want to see in Oklahoma law. A lot of times I'll see that happens when a constituent comes to a legislator with a concern. All it takes is one constituent with a concern for a legislator to take action. It depends on the legislator, and it depends on the situation that they're aiming to remedy. So these proposed changes, like we said, are put into bills. Each bill has to follow the designated process to become law. We'll talk a little bit about the exceptions. I have learned over the years that there's always exceptions to the process and to how things are supposed to work. But for our purposes today, we'll just talk about how the process is designed to work. So the first step to a bill becoming law is the bill has to pass out of committee in the chamber of origin. So by that I mean House bills have to pass out of House committee, Senate bills have to pass out of Senate committee. So when you're looking at bill numbers, you'll see like HB 1732 or SB 456. If it has an HB at the beginning, that means that it's a House bill. If it has an SB at the beginning, that means it's a Senate bill. And like I said, House bills start in House committees and Senate bills start in Senate committees. If the bill passes out of the committee in Chamber of Origin, then it goes to the floor in Chamber of Origin, where it has to pass there to go to the opposite chamber. Most bills require just a simple majority to pass off the floor. However, Oklahoma has several exceptions to that. One of them being if there's any increase in any type of tax, it requires a supermajority to pass. But for the most part, most bills just require a simple majority. So once the bill passes out of committee and off the floor in the Chamber of Origin, it goes to the opposite chamber. So House bills would go to Senate committee, Senate bills would go to House committee. If it passes that third step, then it goes on to the floor of the opposite chamber. So again, House bills would have to pass off the Senate floor, Senate bills would have to pass off the House floor. Bills that pass off of the floor and they are unchanged from the original chamber, they then go to the governor for signature, and the governor will either sign or outright veto or can do something called a pocket veto. And then the bill becomes law on the effective date listed in the bill. So we'll talk about that a little bit more later, but the effective date is very important in determining when compliance is required. Okay, so moving on to slide 5, as discussed before, we're now going to talk about a few of the circumstances which can trigger a change to the process or the process becoming lengthier. So here's a few examples of those. The bill language changes when it gets to the opposite chamber. So like I said, if the bill doesn't change, then it goes on to the governor's desk. But if the language the House sends over to the Senate, if the Senate votes it out of committee and votes it off the floor, but they have changed the language, it then has to go back to the House so the House can vote on it with the new amended language. Another thing that can change the process is if a bill fails to pass a deadline. So each legislature in Oklahoma is a 2-year cycle. So if a bill fails to pass the deadline in the first of 2 years, it becomes what we call dormant for the remainder of that session year. So if it passes out of the committee and the original chamber, but it does not pass off the floor, then it just kind of lies in wait at the House floor until year 2 of 2. And wherever that bill did not pass the specific deadline, it picks back up in that spot the next year for year 2 of 2. Some bills are also required to go through multiple committees. I won't get into the weeds on this now, but this year for the 2025 session, the House added a lot of committees and really an extra layer of committees. And so they have policy committees, and then they have the committee after that before they can actually go to the floor. And so we will know in 2026 if they stick with that methodology. I think it probably made the process a little more lengthy in some ways and maybe not lengthy enough in others for House leadership. So we'll see what they do in 2026. Okay, so bills that have to go through multiple committees, most of the time you're going to see that when it is a bill that has a fiscal impact, which means it has a cost to the state or to individuals, especially to the state, because that's what the legislature is concerned about, because they want to have a balanced budget. And by adding law that requires the state to spend more money, it makes it that much harder to balance the state budget. So bills go through subject matter committees and then to the appropriations committee if they have a fiscal impact. So I already talked about this. I jumped ahead of myself here, that they have the policy committee and then the oversight committee in the House now. They're not doing that in the Senate. So the Senate process is the same as it has always been, which is committee and then appropriations if it has a fiscal impact, and then directly to the floor. Okay, now we're moving on to slide 6, and I mentioned effective dates before. Every bill has an effective date. Bills that the legislature considers an emergency for the preservation of public health and safety, those usually contain what is called an emergency clause. Now, the legislature has to vote whether or not to accept an emergency clause if a bill author puts it on the bill. But if it does have an emergency clause, that means the bill becomes law as soon as the governor signs the bill. Bills without emergency clause, more often than not, they'll have an effective date of November 1st of the year that the bill was signed for that session year. That means the provisions of that bill become law and binding requirements on November 1st. However, sometimes you see other effective dates. Another one that I see a lot is July 1st. It's not as frequent as November 1st, but they want to give people oftentimes a little bit of time to prepare to meet the new requirements. And so that's kind of a happy medium between a November 1st effective date and then an effective date with an emergency clause, which is upon governor's signature. So another thing that I see ever so often is if the bill is going to require a whole lot of pieces to the puzzle before the requirements can be met, they'll push the effective date out even further. So I've seen an effective date for example, for a bill that moved an entire state agency that was autonomous. It was moving it under another state agency. That effective date was not July 1st of the session year, but July 1st of the following year, because there's a lot of pieces to that puzzle to move a whole state agency. There's a lot of logistics and behind the scenes requirements that have to be addressed. Technology, legal, budget, and finance, things like that have to be addressed so that when that agency is engulfed by another agency, it can do so as seamlessly as possible. Okay, vetoes. I mentioned a little bit about vetoes before, but the governor, as the head of the executive branch for the state, he or she has the authority to veto any bill that passes through both chambers of the legislature and is presented to him or her for signature. So like I said before, the governor can outright veto a bill. Typically when that happens, the governor sometimes issues what's called a veto message, and that really contains insight as to why he or she vetoed that bill. It will say, this is unnecessary, this is, not a prudent use of taxpayer dollars, or whatever the reason is. They'll contain that reason in the veto message. However, sometimes there are bills that are vetoed and there is no veto message. It's just a veto, and the veto is the veto. And then we're left to kind of hypothesize as to why that veto occurred. So like I also mentioned before, the governor has a designated amount of time to sign bills, which come to he or she for signature. If the governor does not take action and sign the bill in the required amount of time, that window of time allotted by law, the bill is vetoed automatically. And like I said before, this is usually referred to as a pocket veto. However, if the governor chooses to veto a bill, that does not necessarily mean it is the end of the bill, because the legislature has the authority to override a veto of the governor, and that is done so with a 3/4 majority to overturn the veto. The legislature has used that power periodically, and I have actually seen it more in the last several years than historically speaking. So when that happens, typically you'll see legislators who maybe voted no on the legislation originally will come back and vote yes, because typically when they take up the veto override, it's to send a message that the legislature does not feel that veto was really in the scope of authority in the governor, although the governor has the authority to veto any bill. So sine die is the official name for the last day of session. So the last day of session, when the governor outright or pocket vetoes the bill, that makes it a little bit more difficult for the legislature to overturn a veto, because the legislature would have to convene a special session to override the veto. And there aren't many bills that would probably fit the bill of what the legislature would deem necessary to call a special session to override that veto. So a lot of times you'll see bills that they think the governor may veto, but they're not sure, and the time frame that he or she has to sign the bill is too long for them to still be in session. They typically change their approach and they'll send that to the governor sooner, so that window of time that he or she has to sign or veto a bill fits within the session before sine die happens. So the legislature and the bill making process is one portion of law in the state. Another portion of law is state agency rules. So agencies promulgate rules, and we're on slide 8 now. And that rule promulgation process is very scripted, because rule has what is referred to as the weight of law. However, sometimes you'll see agency rule will conflict with statute, and when that happens, statute reigns supreme. Statute is the ultimate authority, and so if rule conflicts with statute, then state agencies and individuals in the state have to defer to statute. So when laws are added, removed, or changed, agencies which have authority over the law, so regulatory agencies that have to enforce the law, or agencies that have to implement certain programs per statute, they oftentimes have to promulgate rules to align those rules with law. Most changes in law, most bills are related to amending existing language. And so that means if state agencies have an existing rule and the statute that governs that rule, it gives them that authority to implement that rule. If that is changed, then they have to update their rules to match. So like I mentioned, the agency rule promulgation process is strictly guided by statute in the Administrative Procedures Act. The governor and the legislature have been working quite diligently the last several sessions to tighten the reins on state agencies in order to better ensure rule chapters align with the agency authority and statute. Sometimes you'll see agency rule operate outside of the confines of what the agency's authority actually is. That has been a lengthy historical approach by state agencies. In 2020, Executive Order 2020-03 required all state agencies to eliminate excessive rules by requiring what the executive order refers to as the 1 in, 2 out approach. So for every one rule they promulgate, they were supposed to take 2 rules out. And then in addition to the 1 in, 2 out, it required an overall agency rule reduction by 25%. So without getting too far into the weeds on that, each agency rule, for the most part, unless agencies have exceeded their statutory authority, and if that's the case, the rule should not exist. But the greatest percentage of agency rules are in existence because statute requires them to have a rule. So it's not as simple as a 1 chapter in, 2 chapters out. State agencies are having to take that section by section and even sometimes sentence by sentence or word by word, because agencies don't have the authority to eliminate an entire chapter of a rule if statute requires them to have it. Additionally, the legislature is currently pursuing a statute change to codify the tenets of this Executive Order 2020-03 into law. So they're pursuing something called the Regulations from the Executive in Need of Scrutiny, commonly referred to as the REINS Act, which would require additional detailed reporting from state agencies to a new branch they propose to add to one state agency, which is called the Legislative Office of Fiscal Transparency, or we call it LOFT. It would add a subgroup to that LOFT, referred to as the Legislative Economic Analysis Unit, or as we like to refer to it, LEW. The LEW would review all proposed agency rules, and then they would make recommendations to the legislature on whether or not to allow those agencies to move forward with proposed rules. There are a lot of extra steps involved there. There's reports that have to be done by the state agencies. It's a pretty involved change that would lengthen and make a more dense rulemaking process to an already very involved process. But the intent behind that is so that the legislature can ensure agencies are not operating outside of their scope of authority. Another bill that would influence rule promulgation this year is SB 1024. That's a proposed change which would require state agencies to submit certain information to the Secretary of State's office for review, and then they would have to have explicit written governor approval before they promulgated rules. And so those recommendations to the governor would come from the Secretary of State's office. So the rulemaking process is very lengthy. This would lengthen it even more, but it would give multiple extra sets of eyes on the process to ensure, like I said, agencies are operating within their scope of authority. Okay, moving on to slide 9. The rule promulgation process, like I said, is very lengthy, But one of the pieces I want to point out that is of interest to educators, specifically when it comes to Department of Education rules, is perhaps the most fundamental portion of the rulemaking process, which is public comment. So all citizens have the right to provide public comment on proposed agency rules during the public comment period. Comments can be submitted through the designated submission system of agencies. Oftentimes that's an electronic submission system, but commenters may also attend the agency's public hearing to provide comment. Now, it is of note that public hearings are not required in statute. However, if an agency promulgates a rule without conducting a public hearing, the public can request a hearing. So if that happens, the agencies have to start the rulemaking process all over again and honor that request, but they have to go back to step one and start again, because all of that has to do with something called a notice of rulemaking intent, which has to include the information on the hearing. So if they don't set out and schedule a hearing, then when the public requests a hearing, they have to go back and redo that notice of rulemaking intent, which could put the whole rulemaking process back by several months. The legislature can also choose to consider public comments when determining whether to allow an agency to adopt a rule. One thing state agencies have to turn into the legislature when they turn in their what we call a rule packet is the agency rule report. And that agency rule report includes the public comment and how the agency responds to those public comments. So that is going to wrap up part one, which is an overview of the legislative process. We are not going to include any early childhood specific pieces in this part of the training because the process is the same no matter what the subject matter of the bills is. But as we move into part two, we will talk specifically to some degree about early childhood relevant bills.